Well, good morning. You turn your Bibles to Matthew chapter 14. And for announcements, next Saturday begins our Bible conference. And it goes Saturday, Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday. And it's our biannual. One year we do the missionary conference, the next year we do the Bible conference. And this is the Bible conference. And I am looking forward to it because it has my favorite subject, faith. And so don't miss a thing. Their announcements are somewhere, but just plan on starting here Saturday afternoon at 5 o'clock, and we'll work it out. Matthew chapter 14. You know, we live in uncertain times. We live in dangerous times. We live in changing times when things seem like in an upheaval and we have nowhere to go. What are we to do? How can we survive in this unchanging world that just seems like it's mixed up? There's wars. There's rumors of wars. There's conflicts. Just reading yesterday about those that were beheaded in the Republic of Congo for naming the name of Christ. Found them. We live in that kind of time. And I am so thankful that we don't have to make our way by ourselves. We've got the Word of God. And we've got the Spirit of God to guide us. So as we look at chapter 14 of Matthew, it is a busy chapter. There are 4 events that are recorded in there. There's the death of John the Baptist. There's the feeding of the 5,000. There's the disciples' trip across the sea at night with Peter walking on the water. And then there is finally Jesus' ministry on the other side, the healing of the multitude there. So there's a lot packed into this chapter. But I want to just look at one event that took place and try to gain from it some instruction on how we can survive in the world we live in. I want to know what God is telling me through this passage. The feeding of the 5,000 is a very familiar story, and there's much there to learn. But we're not going to look at that. I want to look at what transpired at the end of that day. It's also a very familiar passage. Peter walking on the water. How could anything be greater than Peter getting out of that boat and walking on the water? It's synonymous with having great faith, having courage, having perfection. We're encouraged just to step out. If we have faith, we can just step out. Step out on the water. Just step out of the boat. Whether it takes reckless abandon, whatever, just step out of the boat. But I want to look at Peter's walk on the wild side from just a little bit different angle. We'll pick up in verse 22. It's at the end of a very busy day. Jesus not only taught the crowd, but he taught his disciples by performing a miracle. He fed 5,000 with 2 fish and 5 loaves. That's a miracle. That's a miracle. Now the day is coming to an end. And Jesus does something that's kind of unexpected. He gives a command. Point number 1 is the command. 22 says immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. He was urgent about this immediately. That means without hesitation. There was no decision to be made. Don't need to fast and pray about this command. I want you to get into the boat, and I want you to go to the other side. Very clear. You know, sometimes we think that God's will for our lives is something mysterious or something that will take great courage. But for these fishermen, they spent their whole life on this boat. They knew that lake. They knew every part of it. They could accomplish it. I mean, just earlier, they made the trip across to get there. The same boat. So it was something that they could do. Secondly, he was emphatic about it. He made the disciples get into the boat. Made. That's a very strong word. It can be translated as to order, or to coerce, or to force, or to pressure. The King James translates it this way, and straightway Jesus constrained the disciples to get into the ship. That little word is a stronger word. To employ force contrary to nature and common sense. Look at what happened that day. The disciples have just experienced a feeding of 5,000. It's a spiritual mountain peak. They are walking around with their feet not even touching the ground. Excited, high-fiving each other, snapping their suspenders and saying, look what we did. It's hard to come up with a reason that they would have to leave and go back across the lake. It's nighttime. They had to travel back at night. Now, this is before we had GPSs and lights on the boats and all that. There were no lighthouses. There was nothing. And go back across that lake at night. I can't believe that Jesus had to order them to do his will. He had to constrain them. We had to get them into the boat and across. I can imagine what the conversation kind of went like. Listen up. I want you to get into the boat. Yes, you, Peter, in the boat. And I want you, yes, Peter, I know it's nighttime. I want you to go across the lake. That lake. Yes, Peter. I know it's nighttime. Peter, focus. Focus on me, Peter. I want you to get into the boat. I know there come storms come up on that lake at night. I know that. I want you to get into the boat. And I want you to go across the lake. Just do what I tell you to do. Almost sounds like we're talking to our kids, isn't it? Just do what I tell you to do. Doesn't that just amaze you? Now, I'm sure there was some grumbling and griping as they loaded the ship up and they had to travel back. And Peter's explaining to James and John, the sons of thunder, that he's a carpenter. He's not a fisherman. And Peter throws his stuff in and he goes, oh, you know what? You shouldn't kick the boat if you got sandals on. Just a little note for you. Get in the boat and get across to the other side. How often is it, though, that the Lord reveals something to us and we fail to listen to him? We don't listen. How often is that? How often does he, like the disciples, have to constrain us? He has to make us do what he wants us to do. It's not unusual. Don't get on Peter's case. Look in the mirror. You know, I was thinking about Jonah. Jonah, I want you to go to Nineveh and I want you to preach the gospel. And Jonah picks up his smartphone, and he gets Expedia.com, and he says, "Get me a ticket that way, the other direction." And God comes along and puts him in timeout for 3 days in the belly of a whale. And he spits him out on the land. And God says, "Jonah, I want you to go to Nineveh, preach the gospel." Well, after 3 days in the belly of a whale, you kind of got your attitude adjusted. And he says, "I'll go, but I won't like it, and I'm going to have the worst attitude you ever saw. But I'll go do what you tell me to do." The Lord had to constrain them to get into the boat. Immediately, he made the disciples get into the boat and to go before him to the other side. They're to get into the boat. They were to leave immediately. They were not to stop until get distracted by anything till they got to the other side. You know, sometimes we think and we feel that God's will is something that's unclear. But that's not always the case. He's given us a manual here. 66 books, which contains everything we need for righteousness. For example, 1 Thessalonians 4:3 tells us that we should be morally pure. Don't have to ask about that. 1 Peter 2:15 says we should be submissive to the government. I don't have to think about that. 1 Peter 3:17 says we should do what's right even if we have to suffer. And 1 Peter 4:17 says if we are to suffer, we're going to have to do it with a good attitude. Now, I don't have to think about that. I don't have to pray about it. I don't have to fast about it. Those are things that are in this book for me to do. He constrained them. Secondly, we see the storm. Verse 23 says, "And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up to the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But the boat by this time was a long way from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them." The storm came up, even though they were in the center of God's will. They were beaten by the waves and the wind. They were doing God's will. Jesus himself had set their course. They were in the center of his will, yet they found themselves in the center of a storm. Sometimes, not always, when we're in the center of God's will, we'll be in the midst of a storm. But Lord, you put me here. Why am I in a storm? Secondly, the wind was against them. Though they were in God's will. Often when we're in God's will, the wind will be against us. Sometimes, but not always. When we're in the center of God's will, the opinions of those that are around us are contrary and can be even discouraging. Doing God's will. Thirdly, they didn't seem to be getting anywhere. They rowed until the fourth watch, which would be around midnight. And there they are, in the middle of a very dark night, in the midst of the sea, and seemingly they were accomplishing nothing. They were getting nowhere. Sometimes we have the idea that if we're in God's will, we'll be guaranteed success. It's not always true. There will be opposition. If you are in the middle of God's will, there will be opposition. What I've learned over the last 7 decades, that's not quite as old as 70 years. You just say 7 decades. Sounds like it's less. Oftentimes, when we're in the midst of the storm, we look around and it's dark and the waves are swelling, and the wind of popular opinion is against us. It's easy to get discouraged and think that all is lost, or to think that you might not have heard him correctly, or we must be doing something wrong. One writer put it this way: discouragement is simply our pride swelling up in us. And as it swells, it begins to exercise our rights. After all, we don't deserve to have to weather a storm. But that's another sermon, so we won't get into that. Oftentimes when we're doing God's will, it seems like the waves are pounding up our fragile craft. We don't know which way to turn. It's at that time we come to the conclusion that the Lord, our Savior, Jesus Christ, has abandoned us, or that we might be punished by God for doing something wrong. Oftentimes, when we look around at those in the midst of the storm and we say to ourselves, we think to ourselves at least, and often we say it, just like Job's friends. Job, you must have sinned. You must have violated some law of God. You must be out of the will of God. We should be helping them in the boat. We should be helping them row. But that's a different sermon. So move on. Thirdly, Jesus is aware. He's aware. Verse 23 says, and after he dismissed the crowds, he went up to the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. What was he doing there? Praying. Who was he praying for? His disciples. But the boat at this time was a long way from land, beaten by the waves. The wind was against them. In the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. You ever experienced that? Are you experiencing that today? You're in the midst of a storm. The sea is raging. You're all alone, and it's dark. You know, there's nothing that comforts us as the fact that Jesus is aware. He's aware of us. He knows where we're at. He knows exactly where we are. He knows exactly what's happening. He's praying for us, meaning he's aware. He's interceding for us. He's not left us alone. He's at the right hand of the Father, interceding for us, knowing full well the storm that we're in. He's not left us alone. He's coming. He's coming to us, and he's coming for us. When it is darkest, the fourth watch, look for him. He's close by. He's right there. He came to them walking on the sea. Now, as a young person for years, I used to get excited about this. Is such an exciting passage. Why did Jesus walk on the water? Well, the simple reason is that's where they were. They were in the middle of the sea. There were no taxi cabs or Ubers to get him there. He walks out there to them. But I think there are a couple other reasons why he walked to them on the sea. Number one was to show the disciples that the very thing that they feared, he had power over. That which they were struggling against was not a problem for him. Walk to them on the sea. Second, to show them how he cares. to encourage them to be steadfast, to persevere through the storm. Verse 26 says, when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It's a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Oh, if we could just stop right there. If we could just stop. Let's close up and go home. But there's much more. Much more to learn from this trip across the sea. Much more. For we see Peter jumping ship. He jumps ship. And Peter answered him, "Lord, thank you for coming in our time of need. Make some room here. Get into the boat. I know everything is going to be okay because you're with us." No. "Lord, if it be you," and you better circle those words. "Command me to come to you on the water." And he said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." It's always been interest to me of why Peter wanted out of the boat. I've pondered this for years. And it's come to me through this time that probably the key thing was pride. That's what I have problems with. He wanted to show others just how spiritual he was. More important, he wanted to prove himself to Jesus. Now, I can understand being in a boat with 11 men who had fish for lunch, and they're rowing, and it's late at night, and this is before right guard. I can imagine him wanting out of that boat. But I have to ask myself, where was he going? Where was he going? Well, we could look at a couple options here. Maybe he was going to the bow. Now, that's the front end of the boat for you landlubbers. And taking a line, now that's a rope for you guys. He would wrap it around his waist, dig his heels in, and start to pull. Meanwhile, yelling back to the 11, "Row, we'll get this boat across." Oh, no. Maybe he was going to the stern, and he would put his shoulder to the back. That's the back of the boat, flat part. And he put his shoulder there and dig his heels in and start pushing. No. Maybe he was going for help. "Hey, guys, I saw a 24-hour fitness right over there. I'm going to go get a dozen of those big, strong, and then we'll have all the power we need to get across." No. Maybe he was going to 7-Eleven for coffee and donuts and a pack of Slim Jims and 12-pack of Mountain Dew or some Red Bull. And no. But this much I do know. Jesus put him in the boat. He told him to get in the boat. And he never tells him to get out. He told him to go to the other side. I do know that. Understand this, it's very important. Jesus never tells him to get out of the boat. It was Peter's idea to get out of the boat. "Lord, if it is you, command me to get out of the boat and to come to you on the water." Now remember, the storm was still blowing, the waves were still crashing. Peter should have cried, "Because it's you. Come quickly, get into the boat. We need you." Instead, he looks for a way out. We do the same thing. I think Peter's response was was spawned by doubt and fear, maybe discouragement, maybe pride. I certainly don't deserve this. Now, what was the result of him getting out of the boat? The storm is still raging. The boat still needs to get rowed. They still need to get to the other side, but now there are only 11 rowing instead of 12. Learn this. When we abandon what God has commanded us to do, His perfect will, whether it's a family, the job, the ministry, no matter what it is, we leave more for the rest to do. We leave more. Now, as the old preacher used to say, hold on tight, children, we're fixing to jump the creek. I want you to go to Mark chapter 6 and read another passage about this same night, for it gives us the reason that Peter abandoned the will of God. Mark 6, beginning in verse 45. Everybody there? Mark 6:45 says, immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him on the other side to Bethesda, while he dismissed the crowd. This is the same story. And after he had taken leave of them, he went up on the mountain to pray. When evening was come, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land. And he saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. And about the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. He meant to pass by them, but when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, take heart, it is I, do not be afraid. And he got in the boat with them, and the wind ceased, and they were utterly astounded. Why? For they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. No, Peter didn't get out of the boat because of great faith, but to show his hardened heart. Faith doesn't say if. Lord, if it is you. Faith says because you are Lord. Remember? Jesus rebuked him for his lack of faith. He said, oh, you of little faith. Now, the faith of a mustard seed, you can move mountains. He didn't even have the faith to do that. It wasn't even the size of a mustard seed. He didn't have faith in God. No, he didn't get out of faith. It was his lack of faith that caused him to abandon the will of God. For an illustration, there's two thieves hanging on crosses, one on each side of Jesus. One said, if thou be the Christ, save thyself and us too. That thief had no faith. If, that same word. The other said, Lord, because you are Lord, remember me. That thief had God-given faith. He didn't ask to be taken out of the storm. He simply wanted the Lord to remember that he was in the storm. But that's another path. That's another message. So here then is the key. By getting out of the boat, Peter was abandoning the perfect will of God for his life and settling for God's permissive will. Never a good idea. Never a good idea. What did he find outside of the will of God? He found wind, opposition. He found fear. He was afraid. He found failure. He began to sink. Wasn't sinking when he was in the boat. He cried out, "Lord, save me." That's the grace of God. In Genesis 19, we see God's judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah and the rescue of Lot. And in Genesis 19 and verse 17, we see God's perfect will for Lot. It was go to the mountain. Lot, go to the mountain. Very clear. You can't mishear that. But Lot sought to change it. No, Lord, let me go over to this little town of Zoar. And God permitted him to do it. To take second best. And if you read chapter 19 and verse 30 to 36, you see that it didn't end well. What kept Lot from going to the mountain? Why did he reject God's will? And take a secondary will. I believe that pride had hardened his heart. For who was in that mountain? Who was up there? Abraham. Abraham loved him. He rescued him. But he didn't want to humble himself and go up there and have to talk to Abraham. Never a good idea to take God's permissive will. 2 Kings 20, we see a king named Hezekiah. And the prophet told him, "Hezekiah, get your stuff together, you're going to die." That was the Lord's perfect will for Hezekiah. But instead of accepting it as such, he threw a pity party. Put his face to the wall, just like a little kid. And accepted his permissive will. And God said, "I'll give you 15 more years." That did not turn out well. He showed the enemy all that he had, his armory, his wealth, his fortifications, everything. He had a son, Manasseh, who was born 3 years into this permissive will, who became king at 12. And God says he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord. You know, Hezekiah, if you stayed with God's will and got your stuff together and died, none of that would have happened. It is so important. You can see Psalms 81:10 again through 16 of Israel chose second best. I'm amazed at how quickly unbelief arises in me. Now, I ask you, did Jesus know that there was a storm coming when he put him on the boat to go across the sea? Of course he did. Who controls the wind? Now, there's something else we've got to consider here in this story. He gave them something to jog their memory. Remember, there were 12 baskets of leftovers, and there were 12 disciples. I believe each one of those disciples would have had a basket when Jesus told them to get in the boat. Each had a reminder of the power of God. So get this picture fixed in your minds. Here's a boat with 12 men in it. Each has a basket of miracle food stuffed under their feet. Each has a direct command, go to the other side. And in the midst of the storm, they're crying out, "Oh, what are we going to do?" It's very important to understand. That's something I've picked up in the last 7 decades. that when, not if, when God allows a test to come into my life, it's never to harm me. It's never to punish me. Instead, it is to help me. It is to teach me. It is to encourage me and to build my faith. The chief goal of the test is to bless, to enrich, and to develop us. How often have I found this to be true? God creates or allows a test to come in my life, so I'll be forced to turn to Him and say, Lord, I really need your help. Instead, I just say, what am I going to do? Oh, I'm in a terrible mess. Now, what do we learn from all this? I've been given a command. Get in the boat. Go to the other side. Take up your cross and follow me. Run the race. Finish the course. Whatever term you want to use. And I've been given a basket of miracle food. The miracle of salvation. Salvation is a miracle. The day He gave me a new heart and caused me to cry out to Him for mercy. The day He saved me. The miracle. I have that. I have the miracle of a marriage. We've been married 53 years almost now. Hard to believe. Time goes so quick. But the miracle of getting us, and sometimes you ask, we'll give you the story of how we got to that place. It was God doing only what God could do to bring us together. I would not be here if it wasn't for Emma praying for me, encouraging me, standing by me, boxing my ears when they needed to be boxed. I have that miracle. I have the miracle of the birth of our children, our grandchildren. The miracle of the keeping power of God. Protected. Nobody should fall off a tractor into a farm disc, and live. No one should be run over by a car and live. No one should have a car fall on them off the jack and live. And 1,000 other things. God has protected me. He's never left me. He's never forsaken me. And even though I have all these, and I sit there with a basket of these miracle food under my feet, when the storm starts to roll and the wind starts to pound against my small craft, I begin to doubt how quickly I say, I'm sinking, there is no hope. And then Jesus comes. And I'm so amazed. I shouldn't be, but I am. Why? Maybe for the same reason as Peter. Look at that last part of Mark 6. And it says they were sore amazed in themselves without measure and wondered. Why? For they considered not the miracle of the loaves, for their heart was hardened. Their heart was hardened. Couple applications for 2025 that were brought to my mind as I prepared this message. There's thousands of Christians who are jumping ship every day. They jump out of the boat, jumping from one church to another, one marriage to another, one ministry to another, and they consider not God or His will in any of it. For they considered not the miracle of the loaves, for their heart was hardened. They're looking for a sea with no storms, a marriage with no heartaches, a church with no conflicts, a job with no problems. Instead, we ought to do is get our oars of faith out and in obedience to the one who has called us, keep the ship pointed in the right direction. And keep it pointed there until the Lord comes. Sometimes I need to be just as stubborn, like an old Missouri mule. And I need to say, God, you put me in this boat, and the storm is fierce, and the winds are against me. But I know when you come, I'll still be in it. I'll still have my oars in the water. We need to have the commitment of Joshua. His last statement, Joshua 24. And if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your father served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. We will serve the Lord. I got to thinking, we got a boat docked right over here, I-25 and Highway 52. There's a boat there. We're to get in that boat, and we're to row that boat to the other side. How long is it going to take? Well, we're planning on 500 years. We're building a 500-year church. It's easy. This is my 4th trip through this kind of thing. And I know there's going to be struggles. And I know there's going to be waves. And I know the wind is going to be blowing. And I know Satan doesn't want us there. I know it's going to be a struggle. But I'm planning to keep my oars in the water. And when the Lord comes, either take me home in the rapture or in death, I will still be pointed that direction. I'd ask you to just take a few minutes to contemplate what you have learned in this, to speak to the Lord about where you're in this. And then we will praise him in song.